Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to embark on a journey in the Middle Ages? Imagine stepping outside your village for the very first time, knowing that your destination, a city you've only heard about in stories, lies somewhere beyond forests you've never entered, across rivers that might sweep you away, and through lands where danger lurks around every muddy corner. Think about this for a moment. Today, when you need to travel anywhere, you pull up a map on your phone, hop into a car or a train, and arrive at your destination in hours, perhaps while listening to music or catching up on your favorite shows. You don't think about bandits. You don't worry about where you'll sleep. You certainly don't wonder if you'll make it back alive. But what if, in medieval times, you decided to travel? What if you couldn't just stay home? What if your family needed you to deliver goods to the next market town, or you were a merchant hoping to trade spices and silks across half of Europe? What if you were a pilgrim called by faith to walk to a sacred shrine, knowing that thousands before you never completed the journey? This is a story about human resilience. This is a story about the people who walked the roads of the medieval world, ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. If you enjoy journeys through history and want to understand how people survived in completely different worlds than ours, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share in the comments where you think you would have traveled if you lived in the Middle Ages. Let's explore this together. We're traveling back to the medieval period, roughly between the 11th and 15th centuries. This is the era of castles and kingdoms, of pilgrims and merchants, of mystery and myth. The world is fragmented into territories controlled by feudal lords. There are no nations as we know them today. There is no unified system of roads, no government safety standards, no emergency services to call. People didn't travel for pleasure back then. They traveled because they had to. A merchant traveled to sell cloth or spices. A pilgrim walked hundreds of miles to visit a sacred shrine, hoping for healing or absolution. A noble traveled to claim inheritance or make peace with a neighboring lord. A craftsman might migrate to a city where his skills were valued. These weren't vacation trips. These were calculated risks, often taken with dread rather than excitement. But here's what's fascinating. Despite all the dangers, despite the hardship, despite the almost certain chance that something terrible could happen, people kept traveling. Not because they were braver than us, not because they were foolish, but because necessity, faith, and the hope for a better life pushed them forward. In these coming moments, we're going to explore what medieval travel actually felt like. We're going to walk the roads with both wealthy nobles and common people. We're going to discuss the food they carried, the dangers they faced, the shelters where they rested their heads. We're going to talk about what they believed, the myths, the superstitions, the terrifying stories that haunted their imaginations as they ventured into the unknown. Imagine stepping outside the gates of your medieval village for the first time. What would greet you? Not a paved road or a marked highway. Not rest stops promising hot food and comfortable bathrooms. Instead, you'd face a world that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. But what exactly would that world look like? What would assault your senses as you took that first nervous step onto the medieval road? Let's begin with what you'd see. The road itself wouldn't be much to look at. In most of medieval Europe, the paths connecting towns were nothing more than muddy tracks worn into the earth by centuries of travelers and merchants before you. In drier seasons, these trails could be hard-packed and almost pleasant to walk on. But rain, and there was plenty of rain in medieval Europe, transformed them into treacherous stretches of thick, clinging mud that could come up to your ankles, sometimes to your knees. The landscape around you would feel simultaneously ancient and alive. Dense forests pressed in on many routes. These weren't the manicured woodlands or peaceful parks you might imagine. These were dark, tangled places where the canopy of leaves blocked out so much sunlight that midday felt like twilight. The trees themselves seemed impossibly old, their gnarled trunks twisted in ways that made them look almost animated, almost malevolent. In mountainous regions, the roads became even narrower and more perilous. Alpine passes forced you to navigate thin paths carved into cliff sides, where one misstep meant a fall to certain death. The Pyrenees and the Alps were particularly notorious. These weren't gentle slopes, these were precipitous routes where your entire focus had to be on your footing, where your peripheral vision caught endless drops below. When you close your eyes, the sounds would define your experience. The medieval road was never silent. If you traveled alone, you'd hear the constant squelch of your boots in mud, the creak of saddle leather if you were fortunate enough to have a horse, the jingle of harnesses and rope. But you wouldn't travel alone if you had any sense. You'd travel with others, merchants, pilgrims, other common folk headed the same direction. And so the road would be filled with the murmur of conversation, the occasional shout, the clip-clop of hooves echoing across the land. In forests, the sounds changed entirely. Birds called from unseen branches. The rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush was constant. Streams trickled over rocks. In the distance, you might hear wolves howling, their cries carrying through the darkness. The forest itself seemed to have a voice, creaking branches, wind through leaves, the settling sounds of ancient trees. The smell of the medieval road was something that would strike anyone accustomed to the sanitized world of modernity. For a moment, you must understand that medieval people had a completely different relationship with their own bodies and their environment. They didn't shower daily or change clothes frequently. Many wore the same garments for months without washing. The smell of unwashed humanity was simply part of existence. As you traveled, you'd encounter the aromas of the natural world, the thick, wet smell of damp earth after rain, the rich scent of decaying leaves in the forest, the occasional stench of animal waste from horses and donkeys. In warmer months, insects were attracted to the trail. The smell of death was never far away. Dead animals left by the roadside, the decomposing remains of creatures who hadn't survived the journey, the acrid reek of disease, lingering in towns where plague had recently passed through. The feel of medieval travel assaulted your body in ways that modern travelers never experience. Your feet ached constantly. Medieval boots, while sturdy, were often uncomfortable and heavy. Blisters formed quickly and became infected easily. If you were fortunate enough to ride a horse, the bouncing and jostling left your buttocks and back bruised and sore. In winter, the cold was absolutely brutal. It wasn't a gentle chill that you could shake off by moving faster. It was the kind of bone-deep cold that made simple movements agony, that turned your fingers numb and useless within minutes, that made you question whether you'd survive the next hour. And the rain, medieval people spoke of it constantly in their records, almost with a sense of dread. Rain meant mud. Mud meant slower progress. Mud meant your clothes stayed wet for days, until the dampness settled into your chest and your throat and became illness. The texture of wet medieval clothing was absolutely miserable. Heavy wool that absorbed water like a sponge, becoming so sodden that it dragged at your body, stealing your warmth and your energy. Summer brought different torments. The heat could be intense, especially on exposed stretches of road. Insects swarmed, mosquitoes from marshy areas, horseflies that bit with vicious intensity, midges that seemed to form clouds around your head. Dust rose in choking clouds behind any group of travelers moving during the dry season. Your throat became parched. You drank from streams and roadside wells without knowing whether the water was fresh or contaminated, whether previous travelers had left something terrible behind in its depths. Then there was the matter of your emotional state, the psychological component of medieval travel. You'd feel a constant, low-level tension. Every sound in the forest made you wonder if this was the moment bandits would strike. Every unfamiliar face at an inn could belong to someone planning to rob you while you slept. Every unexplained delay, a broken wagon wheel, a stream swollen from rain, felt like a potential death sentence, pushing you closer to nightfall and the dangers of traveling in darkness. Today, you have GPS and hotels and rest stops with hot food. You have medical care available at almost any moment. You have communication devices that let you call for help if something goes wrong. The medieval traveler had none of this. If something went wrong, it was wrong. There was no backup plan. There was only what you could physically do with your own two hands and the hope that other travelers might help you if disaster struck. Understanding the physical reality of medieval travel helps us grasp why the active journey was considered such a monumental undertaking. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't an adventure to be eagerly anticipated. It was a trial to be endured, a gauntlet to be run, a test of your body and spirit in equal measure. Now that we understand the physical environment of medieval travel, we need to consider who was actually doing the traveling and how they went about it. Because the medieval world was rigidly stratified, wealthy and poor, nobles and peasants, they didn't travel the same roads or experience the same journey, even when going to the same destination. If you were born into poverty in a medieval village, the odds that you'd travel far from your birthplace were limited. Travel required resources. It required time away from work. It required courage. Most common people stayed close to home, within a few miles of where they were born, working the land or practicing a trade that kept them in one location. But a few did travel, and when they did, their experience was profoundly different depending on whether they were wealthy or poor. Let's imagine two different travelers, both heading toward a distant city, but belonging to entirely different social classes. Our first traveler is a wealthy merchant, perhaps a master craftsman or a trader, with enough resources to have accumulated modest wealth. He's perhaps in his 40s, with weathered skin and sharp eyes that miss nothing. He rides a good horse, not the finest in the kingdom, but solid, reliable. He wears warm wool clothing, dyed in colors that suggest his profession brings him decent income. His traveling party is modest but meaningful. He might have 2 servants with him, perhaps carrying additional supplies and merchandise. When our merchant approaches an inn or monastery along the road, the treatment he receives is noticeably different from what awaits poorer travelers. At monasteries, which were often the primary accommodation for travelers of all classes, the monks would greet a wealthy traveler with genuine warmth. Remember that monasteries fulfilled a spiritual obligation to offer hospitality to welcome guests as they would welcome Christ himself. But they also had practical needs. They needed donations, patronage, and the support of wealthy members of the community. A traveling merchant or a noble of considerable standing would be invited to dine with the abbot. He might receive a private room, or at least a chamber shared with only 1 or 2 other travelers of similar standing. He'd be offered the better food, fresh bread, perhaps some cheese, maybe even meat on feast days. His horse would be stabled and cared for with attention. The monks would treat him with deference, and he would feel as though the journey, while still arduous, was at least made bearable by such comforts as were available. When he stopped at an inn and inns were becoming increasingly common, especially near major cities or along well-traveled routes. He'd receive similar treatment. By the late medieval period, English inns in particular were thriving businesses. These establishments weren't luxurious by any modern standard, but they offered predictable comfort. He'd have a relatively private sleeping space, perhaps with a bed frame, a mattress stuffed with straw, and blankets to keep the night cold at bay. He'd eat food prepared in the inn's kitchen, perhaps a stew with meat, bread, and ale. If he had a coin, he could have a fire in his room, a rare luxury in a cold world. The merchant also benefited from the ability to travel as quickly as the roads permitted. He might cover 20 to 40 miles in a day, depending on conditions. This meant he could plan his journey with some certainty. He could arrange to meet business partners at specific times, knowing approximately when he'd arrive in various cities along his route. Now consider our second traveler, a common pilgrim. She's a woman in her 60s, perhaps a widow seeking absolution or hoping that a pilgrimage to a holy shrine might cure her of the arthritis that makes her daily life painful. She has saved coins for years to make this journey. She has purchased what supplies she could afford, but her resources are limited. She travels on foot, wearing sturdy but worn boots that cause her constant pain, carrying a small bundle containing everything she owns for the trip. When this pilgrim approaches a monastery, she faces a different reception. Yes, the rule of Saint Benedict commands hospitality, but many monasteries, by the later medieval period, had become overwhelmed by travelers. The Cluniac Priory at Bermondsey in London, located just off the London-Dover Road, was so burdened with guests that its finances were severely strained. Reading Abbey found itself in similar circumstances, so many pilgrims and travelers, that the abbey found itself in debt because of its hospitality obligations. The result was that many monasteries began to distinguish between wealthy guests and poor ones. The poor pilgrims especially would be fed and housed, yes, but they'd receive the basics only: a simple room, perhaps shared with other poor travelers, filled with the smell of unwashed bodies and sickness, food consisting of thin gruel, hard bread, and water. The monks would fulfill their spiritual obligation, but without enthusiasm, without the sense that they were welcoming Christ himself. And many monasteries went even further. Rather than welcome poor travelers inside their walls, they built separate hospices outside the abbey gates. These were intended as charitable acts, but they also served to keep the poor separated from the wealthy pilgrims and the monks themselves. These hospices offered minimal comfort, perhaps a roof overhead and some basic food, but nothing that would encourage lingering. If our pilgrim stopped at an inn, she faced yet another challenge. The most comfortable inns catered to wealthy merchants, but inns were diverse establishments serving different clientele. The largest inns might have common sleeping areas where many travelers were crowded together in one large room, often separated only by low partitions into different sections. This meant sleeping in close proximity to dozens of strangers, merchants, other pilgrims, travelers of uncertain character. The accommodation was basic: straw on the floor that was rarely cleaned, its surface covered with the inevitable parasites and vermin that came with medieval life. The air was thick with the smell of many unwashed bodies. Disease spreads easily in such conditions. Respiratory infections, dysentery, skin conditions, these were occupational hazards of shared sleeping spaces. Our pilgrim would need to ration her coins carefully. An inn night might cost less than a monastery, but every coin spent on lodging was a coin not spent on food or emergency medical care. She might skip meals to preserve her money. She might walk through the night to avoid paying for accommodation. She might travel with other pilgrims, sharing expenses and offering mutual protection simply because solo travel was too dangerous and too expensive. Furthermore, The poor traveler faced different hazards than the wealthy merchant. A wealthy merchant with servants and good horses, traveling quickly and carrying coin to bribe bandits if necessary, had better odds of reaching his destination. But a poor pilgrim, traveling slowly on foot, with few possessions and no coin to offer as ransom, was an attractive target for robbers. She might be attacked multiple times along a single route. She had no recourse if robbed, no way to communicate with authorities, no way to recover her losses. Today, theoretically, a poor person and a wealthy person can travel the same routes and receive similar treatment at hotels, restaurants, and public accommodations. True, a wealthy traveler might choose more expensive options, but the legal principle of equal access to public services applies. Not so in the Middle Ages. A person's wealth determines not just the quality of their journey, but potentially whether they lived or died along the way. Medieval travel was thus deeply intertwined with social class. Who you were determined where you could sleep, what you could eat, and ultimately how safe you were. The wealthy faced real dangers, certainly, but the poor faced something more like a gauntlet of hardship and risk that could break them body and spirit. Understanding how people traveled leads naturally to the question of what they ate and drank along the way, because feeding yourself during a medieval journey was a complex matter of planning, preservation, and significant compromise with what you might actually want to eat. Picture this scenario. You've been walking for 6 hours, your feet hurt, your legs ache, you're thirsty and tired. It's time to eat. But what exactly is available to you? You're not stopping at a restaurant. You're not accessing a convenience store. You're eating what you either carried with you or what you can purchase or beg from other travelers and small settlements along the way. The most common traveling food in the medieval period was bread. Bread was the foundation of every diet, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest noble. But traveling bread was different from everyday bread. It needed to last without spoiling, which meant it needed to be dense and dry. Many travelers purchased biscuits bread baked twice, a technique developed by crusaders who needed supplies that would keep for weeks at sea. These biscuits were hard as stone. You couldn't just bite into them. You had to soak them in water or broth to soften them enough to chew. Imagine dunking hard, flavorless discs of bread into water and eating them as porridge. It was sustenance, certainly. It was often the only food many travelers had for days on end, but it was also monotonous to the point of despair. Dried meat and dried fish accompanied bread for those who could afford it. Medieval people had perfected the arts of smoking, salting, and drying meat to preserve it for long journeys. Smoked ham, salted cod, dried sausages, these were luxury items in the medieval diet, affordable only to those with significant resources. A poor traveler might eat dried meat once a week. If fortunate, a wealthy merchant might have it at every meal. But dried meat brought its own challenges. It was intensely salty, sometimes so salty that you had to soak it in water overnight before cooking it, then boil it multiple times to make it edible. It was also very hard. Your teeth had to be strong to gnaw through these dense, preserved foods. Many medieval people by middle age had lost half their teeth or suffered constant dental pain from this diet. Fresh fruit and vegetables were available seasonally along the road, particularly in late summer and autumn. Merchants traveling through productive regions might purchase apples, pears, or nuts at local markets. Dried fruits, raisins, figs, dates were expensive luxury items. The Crusaders returned from the Holy Land with knowledge of drying fruits, and these items became increasingly available as the medieval period progressed. A handful of dried fruit could provide quick energy and a brief break from the monotony of bread and meat. For beverages, medieval travelers faced significant challenges. Water was unsafe. We understand now that stagnant water carries bacteria and parasites that cause dysentery and other waterborne illnesses. Medieval people didn't understand the mechanism, but they understood from bitter experience that drinking random water often made you sick. This is one reason why ale and wine were so important in the medieval diet. These beverages were fermented, and fermentation killed many pathogens. Therefore, most travelers drank ale or weak beer throughout the day. You might stop at a settlement and purchase a mug of ale. You might have a small container of beer or cider in your traveling pack. These fermented beverages were caloric as well as safe, providing significant energy for the day's travel. Cheese was another portable protein. Hard cheeses aged in wax could last weeks or months without refrigeration. They were expensive, but they provided calories and taste something different from the endless bread and dried meat that form the core of most travelers' diets. For wealthy travelers, particularly nobles and high-ranking merchants, food was more varied and interesting. They might carry prepared foods in jars, preserved fruits, honey, small cakes made with spices and sugar. At monasteries and inns, a wealthy traveler might eat chicken, fresh fish if near a river or coast, cheese, bread, vegetables, and perhaps even desserts made from honey and dried fruit. But here's the crucial thing: even wealthy travelers experienced the constant concern of finding food. You couldn't simply stop anywhere. You needed to plan to reach a town or monastery before dark, knowing that food would be available there. If you missed that stop because of a delayed crossing or broken wagon wheel, you went hungry. And hunger, while physically active, while stressed and uncomfortable, was a debilitating force. Did you know that preserved foods sometimes preserved things you didn't want? Medieval travelers had no way of knowing if the salted meat they'd purchased contained the eggs of parasites, or if the water they drank from a stream would give them dysentery. Food poisoning and waterborne illnesses killed or seriously incapacitated many travelers. One noble, Guillaume X, Duke of Aquitaine, died of dysentery. He contracted during a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, a journey undertaken for spiritual reasons that instead ended in death from infected water and spoiled food. Eating while traveling in the medieval period was less about pleasure and more about survival. You ate what was available, you ate what you could afford, and you dealt with the consequences of food preservation methods that we would now consider primitive and dangerous. With food and basic survival addressed, we now turn to one of the most persistent fears that haunted every medieval traveler: the danger of bandits and robbery. What was the most likely way your medieval journey could end in disaster? If you traveled at night, you might fall into a ravine or into a river. If you traveled alone, you might contract a fatal illness. If you were unlucky, you might encounter wild animals. But statistically, the greatest threat to any medieval traveler was human violence. Bandits were a constant, inescapable threat. These weren't organized crime syndicates with elaborate plans. They were, in many cases, desperate men, unemployed mercenaries between wars, impoverished nobles whose inheritances were too small to live on, criminals fleeing punishment, refugees displaced by warfare or natural disaster. They hunted along the roads. They particularly favored narrow mountain passes where escape routes were limited, dense forests where they could hide and prepare ambushes, and the approaches to major cities where travel was heavy and merchants were known to carry significant valuables. A band of 5 or 6 armed men with knowledge of a particular stretch of road, could become wealthy through simple violence. The bandit attack was terrifying and brutally efficient. Imagine you're a merchant, traveling with 2 servants and a few pack animals carrying goods. You round a bend in the forest, and suddenly men emerge from the trees. They're armed with swords, knives, clubs. They're blocking your path, and there's no time to run. The bandits would demand your valuables. They might demand your animals. They might take your clothes and leave you naked on the road to find your way back to civilization. In extreme cases, they'd murder the travelers, leaving no witnesses to identify them or describe their appearance. The psychological torment was constant. Every journey began with the understanding that you might not survive. Every sound in the forest, every group of strangers you encountered on the road, every unexpected armed man could represent a fatal threat. Many travelers made their wills before embarking, very consciously acknowledging that they might not return. There were hierarchies of banditry. At the lower level were common brigands, desperate men resorting to violence out of necessity or vice. But at another level were the robber barons, feudal lords who had discovered that using their position of authority to extract excessive tolls and taxes was more profitable than legitimate governance. The robber barons were particularly prevalent in the Germanic regions during certain periods, especially during the Great Interregnum, 1250 to 1273, when central authority in the Holy Roman Empire collapsed. Local nobles, suddenly, without strong oversight, began charging exorbitant tolls for passage across their territories. Sometimes they charged legitimate tolls, simply demanding payment far above any reasonable standard. Other times they simply robbed merchants outright, seizing everything valuable and leaving the merchant to continue the journey penniless. The distinction between legitimate taxation and outright banditry was fluid and often arbitrary. If a noble had title to land through which a trade route passed, did he have the right to charge tolls? Technically, yes, but how much could he charge? Was there a maximum? If a merchant refused to pay, was the noble within his rights to seize the merchant's goods? Different lords answered these questions differently, and conflict was constant. These robber barons became so notorious that special military orders were partially founded to combat them. The Knights Templar, famous as crusader warriors, were also employed as protectors of trade routes and pilgrims. In Spain, local rulers built castles and guard towers specifically along the Camino de Santiago pilgrimage route to protect travelers from bandit attacks. Despite these protections, attacks continued regularly. A 14th century pilgrim named Domenico Laffi recorded being attacked 3 times during a single journey to Santiago. Another traveler, William Way, noted that pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem in 1458 had to travel in large armed groups and pay for additional guards when passing through regions notorious for banditry. Organized caravans became the response to this threat. Merchants would coordinate to travel together, hiring armed guards for protection. A caravan might consist of 30 or more merchants, with servants and sometimes professional mercenaries all traveling together. There was strength in numbers. Bandits might attack a lone merchant or a small group, but an organized caravan with armed defense was substantially more dangerous to assault. These caravans followed established routes, stopped at known caravanserais, protected inns built specifically for caravans, and maintained careful schedules. A merchant knew approximately where a specific caravan would be on any given day, which meant he could plan to meet it or avoid it depending on his needs. But not everyone could join a caravan. Poorer travelers, Solo pilgrims, craftsmen migrating alone, they had to take the risk. Some hired guards if they could afford it. Many simply traveled with other poor people, hoping that a group of 6 or 8 unarmed travelers might seem too much trouble to rob. It wasn't a reliable strategy, but it was the only option available to them. The greatest irony was that attacking a pilgrim was sometimes considered particularly fortunate by bandits. These holy travelers often carried blessed objects or religious relics. Medieval people believed that these items held spiritual power. A bandit who stole from a pilgrim might feel that he was winning a lottery prize, acquiring not just material valuables, but spiritual power. Of course, the religious interpretation worked both ways. A pilgrim attacked and robbed while on a spiritual journey could feel that suffering had been imposed as divine judgment or a test of faith. The threat of banditry was so pervasive that it fundamentally shaped how medieval people thought about travel. No journey was ever free from the possibility of violence. You might have survived disease, hunger, and weather, only to be murdered for your purse and your shoes within sight of your final destination. This wasn't paranoia. This was genuine risk, born from the practical reality of a world where law enforcement was minimal and violence was a realistic option for desperate or greedy men. Beyond the threats created by human violence, the natural world itself presented its own collection of hazards, and some of these natural dangers were amplified by medieval beliefs and superstitions, creating a mental landscape as dangerous as the physical one. Medieval people believed in a world fundamentally different from ours. They believed in magic, in the supernatural, in a landscape populated by spirits, demons, witches, and divine interventions. This wasn't merely superstition, it was a genuine framework through which they understood reality. And this framework profoundly affected how they experienced travel and what they feared about it. Let's begin with the forests. Medieval forests were vast, dark, and old. They covered more land than we might realize, and they represented genuine danger. But they also represented something more: the unknown, the place beyond civilization where normal rules didn't apply. Medieval people had inherited from their pagan ancestors a deep belief in forest spirits. They believed in fairies and elves, not the delicate, pretty creatures of later imagination, but dangerous beings with their own agenda and their own magic. They believed in demons and witches who made their homes in deep forests. They believed that certain forests were enchanted, that travelers could enter them only to emerge days later, discovering that weeks had passed. They believed in creatures that had never been seen but were absolutely real: giants, perhaps, or wolves the size of horses, or beings that were something between human and animal. These beliefs weren't random or arbitrary. They arose from the genuine dangers of forest travel. A person could get lost in a medieval forest and die of starvation or exposure while still being just a few miles from the nearest village. A person could become delirious from fever or injury, and their confused perceptions could easily convince them they'd encountered something supernatural. A person traveling alone could see shapes in the darkness and project meaning onto them, interpreting the movement of shadows as evidence of supernatural beings. More grounded was the actual threat from wild animals. Bears still inhabited parts of medieval Europe. Wild boars were present, and dangerous medieval hunting records describe boars as malicious animals with satanic associations, capable of killing dogs, horses, and men when cornered. Wolves were present in greater numbers than we might expect, particularly in harsh winters. Though historians debate how frequently wolves actually attacked humans, periodic records describe packs of starving wolves roaming into medieval cities. A particularly bad winter in the 1400s saw man-eating wolves in Paris, an unusual but documented occurrence. Medieval travelers would have been aware of these threats, even if the actual likelihood of encountering them was relatively low. A group of armed travelers traveling together faced minimal danger from wildlife. A lone person or small group was more vulnerable. Then there were the rivers and water crossings. Medieval bridges were far fewer than we might imagine. Many rivers couldn't be crossed on foot at all. The current was too strong, the water too deep. Travelers had to ford rivers, wading through water that could sweep them away if they miscalculated, or they had to pay tolls to boatmen who knew the safe crossing points. But the boatmen themselves were sometimes unscrupulous, robbing pilgrims mid-crossing or, in extreme cases, dumping them into the water and stealing their possessions. In spring, mountain snow melt would swell rivers into torrents. Flash floods could appear with little warning, sweeping away bridges, washing away entire sections of road, and drowning anyone caught in their path. Medieval chronicle accounts describe catastrophic floods with an almost matter-of-fact tone, noting how hundreds of people and livestock drowned, how entire villages were erased, how the force of the water was so tremendous that it moved massive quantities of earth and stone. Weather in general was a serious hazard. Winter travel was dangerous. Snow and ice could make mountain passes impassable. Travelers caught in blizzards sometimes froze to death within sight of shelter. Summer brought heat, drought, and insects. Autumn brought unpredictable storms. Medieval chroniclers recorded years of particularly severe weather, prolonged freezes, unending rain, droughts that destroyed crops and left travelers unable to find food at settlements along the way. Medieval people attributed much of this weather to divine will or to demonic interference. A particularly harsh winter was God's judgment on sinful people. A flood that appeared out of nowhere might be evidence that witches had cast spells. Lightning storms were terrifying, not just for the real danger they presented, but because they were interpreted as divine judgment raining down from heaven itself. Given all these hazards, the bandits, the wild animals, the rivers, the weather, the diseases, did you ever wonder why medieval people took the risk at all? Why not simply stay home, in the one place where survival was relatively assured? The answer is that necessity and faith were more powerful than fear. A merchant could die on the road, but he could also become wealthy. A pilgrim could perish from disease, but she could also find healing at a sacred shrine. A craftsman could be robbed of everything, but he could also find a city where his skills were valued and he could build a new life. The road was dangerous, but sometimes the dangers of staying home were worse. We've explored the physical dangers and natural hazards, but medieval travel also involved a more subtle danger, the possibility that you might not be who you claim to be, and the consequences of that revelation. If you were a medieval person with faith and time, you would likely make a pilgrimage at some point in your life. You might walk to a shrine believed to hold the relics of a saint. You might undertake a journey to a place where a miracle had occurred. These weren't casual trips. These were spiritual undertakings, journeys that were believed to bring absolution, healing, or divine favor. The most famous routes in medieval Europe became superhighways of faith, worn into the landscape by millions of feet over centuries. The route to Santiago de Compostela in Spain was one of the most famous pilgrimage routes. The Camino de Santiago drew pilgrims from across Europe. The shrine supposedly held the relics of Saint James, and medieval belief held that making this pilgrimage would bring absolution for sins. Pilgrims wore distinctive symbols, a scallop shell pinned to their clothing, to identify themselves as Santiago pilgrims. These symbols served as primitive travelers' identification, allowing innkeepers and monasteries to recognize pilgrims and treat them according to established customs. The Via Francigena led to Rome, the heart of Western Christianity and the seat of the Pope. This route passed through France, crossed the Alps, descended into Italy, and terminated at Rome. The journey could take months depending on where you started. Along the route, monasteries and hospices had developed to support the flow of pilgrims. Certain roads became lined with these pilgrim support facilities, essentially creating a pilgrim infrastructure. The most difficult and prestigious pilgrimage was to Jerusalem itself, the ultimate holy site, the place where Jesus had walked and died. But reaching Jerusalem from Europe required either a grueling overland journey through unfamiliar lands and hostile territories, or passage by ship through the Mediterranean. Pilgrims traveling by ship faced different hazards: storms at sea, pirates, crew illness. Some opted for the land route, an even more hazardous proposition. Along these established routes, a pilgrim culture developed. Pilgrims developed their own visual identity through their distinctive clothing and symbols. They developed their own ethical code, the expectation that pilgrims would be treated with a degree of charity and protection. Religious orders like the Knights Templar developed partly to provide this protection. Pilgrim records reveal a surprising detail: pilgrim status could be faked. A person could purchase scallop shells and pilgrim credentials and travel under the guise of religious pilgrimage when their actual intentions were criminal. This created a genuine paradox. The pilgrim was supposed to be a holy person deserving protection, but in practice, pilgrim status could be assumed by anyone. This ambiguity created opportunities for deception and fraud that medieval society had to grapple with. The development of pilgrimage infrastructure represented medieval society's attempt to make travel safer and more reliable, but it also created a specialized landscape that separated different types of travelers and different travel experiences. The nature of medieval travel differed not just based on social class and the dangers encountered, but also based on the specific mode of transportation chosen. How you traveled in the medieval period, whether you walked, rode a horse, or traveled by carriage, fundamentally shaped your experience. Let me present three primary options available to medieval travelers and examine what life looked like from each perspective. The walking traveler. Most people walked, not because they wanted to, but because that was their only option. A common person might own a horse if he was reasonably successful in his craft or trade, but many own nothing but their own two legs. Walking meant covering 15 to 20 miles per day in good conditions, potentially as little as 10 miles per day if weather was bad or the terrain was difficult. Walking was intimate with the landscape. You felt every hill, you noticed every stream, you experienced the land at human pace, which meant you had time to observe details that someone on horseback might miss. But this also meant maximum vulnerability to fatigue, disease, and predation. A walking traveler could stop to rest, but that meant losing daylight and potentially not reaching the next settlement before dark. A walking traveler was slower, which meant a longer journey and more time for things to go wrong. The horse rider. A person wealthy enough to own a decent horse experienced travel completely differently. Horses could cover 30 to 40 miles per day, nearly double the distance a person could walk. This meant a significantly shorter journey and a reduced risk of things going catastrophically wrong. But horses came with their own complications. They required feeding and care. A traveler couldn't simply leave a horse unattended. It needed to be stabled, fed, watered. This meant stopping at towns and inns with appropriate facilities. A horse merchant traveling through areas where there were few settlements would face genuine problems. Furthermore, horses could spook, could become lame, could die on the road. A traveler whose horse died suddenly was left stranded, far from home, without his primary means of transportation. The carriage traveler. Only the wealthy traveled by carriage. Medieval carriages were heavy wooden vehicles, suspended by chains or leather strapping that provided minimal comfort. A carriage required multiple horses, usually 4 or more needed a driver, and sometimes multiple servants. The cost of maintaining this level of transportation was extraordinary, affordable only to nobility and the richest merchants. And yet, medieval carriages were slow. The same carriage that required such massive expense to maintain and operate could only travel as fast as the horses could pull it, often slower than a good horseman could ride. The carriage was also fragile. Wheels broke, axles cracked, suspension straps tore. A broken carriage in the wilderness could leave its occupants stranded for days waiting for repairs. The interior of a carriage could be fitted with cushions, tapestries, and provisions, theoretically offering comfort. But in practice, medieval carriage travel was bone-jarringly uncomfortable. The constant jolting, the close quarters, the jolting caused by ruts and rocks in the road all combined to make carriage travel as physically exhausting as walking, just in a different way. The mode of transportation you used determined not just how long your journey took, but who you traveled with, what hazards you faced, and how your body felt at the end of each day's journey. Now that we've examined the people, the dangers, the routes, and the methods of travel, we need to consider one final crucial aspect: what happened when you finally stopped for the night. You've walked for hours. Your feet ache beyond what you thought possible. The sun is descending toward the horizon. Darkness will come soon, and you absolutely cannot be on the road after dark. Where will you sleep? What options are available? And how safe will you be when the night comes? Your accommodation options depended on where you were on your journey. If you'd reached a major city, inns were available. Late medieval English inns had become sophisticated establishments. These were typically built around a central courtyard with rooms opening onto galleries. The best inns had private or semi-private rooms. The cheaper ones offered common sleeping areas where dozens of travelers might sleep in one large room. The experience of sleeping in a common room was profoundly different from modern hotel accommodations. Imagine a space perhaps 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, filled with sleeping bodies on straw. There's minimal privacy, perhaps low partitions between sections, but you can hear every sound, smell every odor, feel vulnerable to theft or assault at any moment. The straw on which you slept was rarely changed and often infested with parasites, lice, fleas, and bedbugs that would follow you for days or weeks after your stay. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, urine, and worse. In dark corners, rats scurried about, looking for scraps of food left by previous guests. The innkeeper's primary interest was profit. He or she charged what the market would bear, removed valuables or possessions if a guest looked obviously wealthy, and provided minimal supervision. A guest might be robbed by other guests during the night. A guest might be murdered. An innkeeper might drug a guest's ale and rob him completely. This happened often enough that experienced travelers would rent private rooms if they could possibly afford it, and would lock their money and valuables to their person even while sleeping. If you were a pilgrim or a merchant of obvious faith, you had another option: the monastery. Monastic hospitality was an important spiritual obligation and also a practical necessity. Pilgrims needed places to stay, and monasteries were often the only building substantial enough to provide accommodation in rural areas. When you arrived at a monastery, you would be questioned about who you were and where you were going. A pilgrim with scallop shell credentials would be recognized and treated accordingly. Once admitted, you would be assigned a room or bed based on your status. A nobleman might receive private chambers with a bed and comforts. A poor pilgrim might sleep on the floor of a dormitory with other poor travelers, or simply in the stable with the animals. The food at a monastery was basic but nourishing. You would be served the monastic diet: bread, beans, vegetables, water, or weak ale. On feast days, or if the monastery was particularly wealthy, you might receive meat or fish. This was infinitely better than what many travelers had eaten on the road. The monastic dormitory was cold and austere. A stone room with minimal heat, straw on a hard floor, or a wooden frame bed with straw mattress, a scratchy woolen blanket, but it was safe. No one was going to rob you or murder you in a monastery. The monks would protect you. You would sleep with the knowledge that you were secure. However, monasteries also had limits. By the later medieval period, many were overwhelmed by travelers. Guests were typically expected to stay only 3 days, unless they were ill or weather prevented travel. Extended stays could strain the monastery's resources, and poor travelers, as mentioned earlier, were sometimes relegated to separate hospices rather than allowed to sleep within the abbey walls. There was also the possibility of sleeping outdoors. In decent weather, many travelers, particularly those without coins, would simply sleep beneath a tree or in the shelter of a roadside shrine. This was dangerous exposure to the elements, vulnerability to bandits and wild animals, but it was free. Medieval travelers had some countermeasures for outdoor sleeping. They might build a small fire for warmth and to deter animals. They would attempt to find naturally defensible positions, a hollow under a cliff, a grove of trees that provided cover. They would travel in groups when possible, taking turns standing watch to guard against surprise attacks. The other significant shelter option was the caravanserai, or inn, specifically built to accommodate merchant caravans. These were substantial buildings built along major trade routes, designed specifically to accommodate the needs of traveling merchants and their goods. They provided stabling for animals, secure storage for merchandise, and dormitory-style sleeping quarters for the merchants and their servants. The physical conditions might be similar to other inns, but the security was better because the caravanserai catered specifically to merchants who expected and could afford protection. A traveler's emotional state during the night was as important as the physical shelter. Lying in darkness surrounded by strangers, unsure if you were safe, aware that you'd be vulnerable if violence began, aware that your possessions could be stolen in the night. This created a constant, low-level anxiety that affected sleep quality and mental health. Many travelers reported chronic sleep deprivation during long journeys. The contrast between the security of a well-maintained inn or monastery and the vulnerability of sleeping outdoors was stark. A poor traveler who couldn't afford inn prices or didn't have pilgrim credentials for monastery stays faced a genuine trial. Sleep deprivation compounded physical exhaustion. An exhausted person travels slower, makes worse decisions, becomes more vulnerable to illness. Finding safe shelter for the night was among the most critical challenges of medieval travel. A traveler who couldn't find shelter faced exposure to elements and predators. A traveler who found substandard shelter faced disease, theft, and assault. Only the wealthiest travelers could reliably count on clean, safe, comfortable sleeping arrangements. With our understanding of where medieval people slept, we can now consider the psychological and spiritual dimensions of travel, the fears and beliefs that shaped how medieval travelers understood their journeys. Medieval travelers moved through a landscape thick with superstition, belief, and deep-seated fear. Some of this fear was rational, grounded in genuine dangers, but much of it was born from medieval theology, from inherited pagan beliefs, from misunderstanding of natural phenomena. These beliefs didn't make the fear less real. If you believed a particular forest was haunted, the forest was genuinely terrifying, regardless of whether ghosts actually existed. If you believed certain days were unlucky, you would avoid traveling on those days, which meant real consequences for your journey timeline. Medieval almanacs listed what were known as evil days, dates when travel was believed to be particularly dangerous. On these days, medieval belief held that if you traveled, you would never return, or you would become mysteriously ill. There were 3 specific Mondays in the year when these beliefs were particularly strong: the first Monday in April, the second Monday in August, and the last Monday in December. The Church attempted to counter these superstitions by dedicating each day of the year to one or more saints, essentially trying to erase the pagan significance of evil days. But the superstitions persisted well into the 19th century. Many medieval travelers planned their journeys around these astrological considerations. They would delay departure if an evil day fell during the time they'd planned to travel. If forced to travel on an evil day, they might take precautions carrying blessed objects, reciting specific prayers, traveling with more people than usual for additional protection. The belief in witches and witchcraft was widespread and deeply embedded in medieval culture. Medieval people understood witches as people, usually women, usually poor or marginalized, who had entered into covenant with demonic forces to gain magical powers. These witches could fly on broomsticks or other objects. They could cast spells. They could transform themselves into animals, particularly cats or ravens. They could make people sick or cause bad luck. A traveler who encountered someone they suspected of being a witch faced a genuine dilemma. Medieval records describe confrontations where travelers would attempt to force suspected witches to perform blessings on their journeys or to curse their competitors. Sometimes this ended in violence. Sometimes it ended in the suspected witch being attacked or killed. The fear was real and often had real consequences. There was also a widespread belief that horses repelled witches. This was one reason that wealthy travelers on horseback considered themselves partially protected from witchcraft. A poor person walking was more vulnerable to magical attack than a person riding a horse. This belief wasn't based on any rational understanding of magic. It was simply something medieval people believed, and the belief had real effects on how they understood their relative safety. The medieval understanding of disease was thoroughly mixed with supernatural beliefs. A person who fell seriously ill during travel might be understood not as having contracted an infection, but as having been cursed. This could result in the ill person being abandoned or abused by their traveling companions, who feared either contracting a curse or being associated with cursed misfortune. Certain places were understood as particularly dangerous or particularly blessed. A forest might have a reputation as haunted. A particular bridge might be known as the site where a murder had occurred, and medieval belief held that the location was therefore haunted by the victim's ghost. A spring or well might be considered blessed because someone had claimed a miracle had occurred there. Medieval people often carried protective items with them on journeys: blessed medallions, relics supposedly containing fragments of saints' bones, rosaries for prayer, crosses, or other religious items. These weren't merely tokens of faith. Medieval people genuinely believed these items provided magical protection. They would have felt substantially more vulnerable if forced to travel without them. The phenomenon of mass hysteria also affected medieval travelers. Crowds of pilgrims moving along a route together could develop collective anxiety or euphoria. Stories of miracles or dangers would circulate, growing more elaborate and terrifying with each retelling. A group of pilgrims moving together might become convinced that they'd witnessed a supernatural event that in reality had been nothing unusual, a strange light in the sky being interpreted as a divine sign, for example. There was also the matter of literal demons and divine intervention in medieval theology. Medieval Christianity taught that the material world was engaged in spiritual warfare. Demons were real and actively attempting to cause harm and suffering. Divine intervention was also real. God could choose to protect or to punish. A journey that went well was understood as divine protection. A journey marked by repeated disasters might be interpreted as divine punishment for unconfessed sins. This created a particular psychological state for pilgrims. A pilgrim undertaking a journey to achieve absolution for sins might interpret every hardship as an opportunity for further redemption through suffering. Bandits who beat and robbed a pilgrim might be understood not as mere criminals, but as agents of divine discipline. A pilgrim who survived a dangerous situation might understand the survival not as luck, but as evidence of divine favor. The counterpoint to this was the fear that a pilgrim might be traveling on a cursed journey, that the pilgrimage itself had been rejected by God. A pilgrim who fell ill or suffered repeated misfortunes might come to believe that God had not approved of their pilgrimage and was actively punishing them for attempting it. This could lead to the pilgrim abandoning the journey, convinced that continuing would only bring further divine punishment. Medieval travelers inhabited a psychological landscape fundamentally different from modern consciousness. They lived in a world where supernatural forces were as real as bandits or weather. They made decisions based on astrological calculations and spiritual beliefs. They interpreted their experiences through a lens of divine purpose and demonic interference. Understanding medieval travel requires understanding this spiritual framework, because it was as real to medieval people as the physical dangers they faced. Having explored how medieval people understood their journeys spiritually and psychologically, we should now consider the actual routes they took and how those routes evolved over the medieval period. Imagine a map of medieval Europe. Now imagine overlaying trade routes on that map, not the major highways we know today, but the ancient paths worn into the landscape by thousands of years of human use. These routes didn't exist because nobody planned them. They existed because they were the paths that worked. The paths where the terrain was negotiable, where water was available, where cities and towns had developed to serve travelers and traders. The Mediterranean remained the highway of medieval trade. Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, rose to prominence through maritime trading dominance. Venetian galleys sailed from Italy to the eastern Mediterranean, establishing trading posts in ports like Alexandria in Egypt. These weren't purely merchant ventures. The Crusades had created a military context that overlapped with commerce. The same Venetian merchants who transported crusaders also established permanent trading posts in crusader-held territories, creating a merchant infrastructure that persisted even as crusader military power waned. The Hanseatic League represented a different model of medieval trade. This league of merchant guilds in northern Europe controlled Baltic trade, dealing in furs, timber, grain, cloth, and preserved fish. These merchants established a trading network that stretched from Russia in the east to London in the west, operating under their own legal system and maintaining their own military forces. The Silk Road in Central Asia connected east and west, carrying luxuries primarily silks, but also spices, precious metals, exotic goods The Silk Road was more accurately described as a vast network of routes rather than a single path. Merchants didn't typically traverse the entire length. Instead, goods would change hands multiple times, with merchants in each region trading goods with merchants from the next region. The trans-Saharan trade routes represented another crucial network. Camel caravans, sometimes numbering in the hundreds of camels, would cross the Sahara Desert, carrying salt and gold between West African kingdoms and the North African coast. These routes were dangerous, the desert was harsh, water was scarce, and coordination was crucial. Runners would be sent ahead to oases to position water reserves for the caravan. The average caravan might consist of 1,000 camels, though some grew to 12,000 or larger. Within Europe, regional trade routes developed connecting major cities. The roads from Italian cities extended north through the Alps. Trade fairs developed in cities like Troyes and Antwerp, where northern and southern traders would meet to exchange goods. These fairs became regular events, drawing merchants from vast distances. The organization of these routes evolved over the medieval period. Early medieval trade was more dangerous and haphazard. As the medieval period progressed, merchant communities organized to protect their interests. Guilds formed, establishing standards and providing collective security. Merchant families became powerful in certain cities, essentially controlling the trade of specific goods. Venetians dominated Mediterranean trade, certain merchant families dominated Baltic trade, and so forth. The physical infrastructure evolved as well. As trade increased, settlements developed specifically to serve traders. These settlements often were located at strategic points, mountain passes, river crossings, coastal points. They provided supplies, accommodation, and security. The caravanserai developed specifically for merchant caravans, providing secure facilities for merchandise and travelers. Trade routes were also disease routes. The same paths that carried valuable spices and silks from China also carried plague bacillus from Central Asia to Europe. The Black Death, which devastated Europe from 1347 to 1352, spread along trade routes. Merchants traveling the routes could carry infected fleas on their goods, spreading plague to every port city they visited. The relationship between trade and disease was so significant that historians can predict plague outbreak patterns by analyzing the location of major trade routes and trade hubs. Medieval trade routes represented the arterial system of medieval society. They connected distant regions and created the possibility of economic development and cultural exchange. But they also created vulnerabilities to attack, to disease, to the concentration of both wealth and danger in specific locations. As we near the end of our exploration of medieval travel, we should consider how wealthy and common people actually experienced different types of journeys, using specific historical examples to ground our understanding. We've journeyed through the complex landscape of medieval travel. We've examined the physical environment, the muddy roads, dark forests, and unpredictable weather. We've explored how social class fundamentally shaped the travel experience. We've discussed the very real dangers, bandits, illness, starvation that faced every medieval traveler. We've considered the psychological landscape of fear, superstition, and faith that shaped how medieval people understood their journeys. What emerges from this exploration is a picture of medieval travel that's more complex and more humanly real than the adventure narratives we often tell. Medieval travel wasn't exciting or romantic. It was grueling, dangerous, and often deeply unpleasant. But that's only part of the story. Throughout all of this, medieval people kept traveling, despite the dangers, despite the physical pain, despite the realistic probability that something could go catastrophically wrong. They kept traveling because their circumstances demanded it, because faith called them forward, because the possibility of improvement outweighed the certainty of hardship in staying home. A wealthy merchant knew he might be attacked by bandits. He traveled anyway, because the profits from successful trade could make him wealthy enough to rise in social status. A poor pilgrim knew she might become ill, might be robbed, might die on the road. She traveled anyway, believing that visiting a holy shrine would bring healing to her arthritic body or absolution for her sins. A craftsman seeking better opportunities in a distant city knew the journey was dangerous. He traveled anyway, because in his home village there was no work, no future, no hope of improvement. This is the essence of medieval travel. It wasn't a choice made lightly. It was a choice made despite the reality of danger, despite the legitimate fear, because the alternative, staying in a limited, constrained life, seemed worse than the risk. Modern humans are disconnected from this experience. We travel in air-conditioned cars and airplanes. We stay in comfortable hotels. We communicate instantly with distant people. We've eliminated most of the practical dangers that haunted medieval travelers. But in doing so, have we lost something? A sense of genuine risk? An understanding of how precarious survival actually is? A sense of what it means to commit to a journey despite genuine uncertainty about the outcome? These questions have no easy answers, but they emerge naturally from understanding medieval travel, a world so different from ours that it illuminates what we take for granted. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the medieval traveler settling down for the night in a monastery dormitory or a roadside inn. They're tired, sore, and uncertain about what tomorrow will bring, but they rest knowing they've survived another day. Tomorrow they'll rise before dawn and continue their journey into an uncertain world. Perhaps that's an appropriate meditation for sleep, the understanding that humans have always moved forward despite fear, despite pain, despite the very real possibility of failure. We've always been travelers, even when the journey was genuinely dangerous. Sleep well and dream of distant roads and the courage it took to walk them.